The vibration of the smartphone against the marble countertop did not merely signal a notification. It felt like a cold, jagged blade sliding between my ribs, severing the last tether of a maternal delusion I had nurtured for nearly 40 years. I was standing in my kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, watching the morning mist cling to the Spanish moss draped over the ancient oaks in my backyard, holding a ceramic mug that still radiated the warmth of fresh coffee. The screen glowed with a name that usually brought a smile to my face, Julian. But the words that followed his name were not a greeting or a request for a recipe or a simple check-in from a devoted son. They were a manifesto of abandonment, a calculated strike delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon who no longer cared if the patient survived. "Do not expect me to take care of you when you are old," the message reads stark and devoid of any softening punctuation. "I have my own life and my own family to prioritize." I stood there for a long time, the steam from my coffee vanishing into the humid morning air, as the silence of the house grew heavy and suffocating. I did not cry, nor did I scream. Instead, I felt a strange, crystalline clarity settle over me, a realization that the boy I had raised with every ounce of my soul had been replaced by a stranger who saw my existence as a looming liability. With a steady hand, I typed a 2-word response that would set in motion a total transformation of my legacy. "Okay," I replied. And then I set the phone down and began the process of reclaiming my life. To understand the weight of that betrayal, one must understand the foundation upon which my world was built. My late husband, Arthur, and I had spent over 3 decades weaving a life of quiet stability in our historic home on Gaston Street. Arthur was an architect who saw the beauty in structural integrity, and I was a high school principal who believed in the power of discipline tempered with love. We were not millionaires, but we were diligent. We lived below our means, invested in diversified portfolios, and paid off our mortgage years ahead of schedule. When Arthur passed away 6 years ago from a sudden pulmonary embolism, he left me with a comfortable inheritance, the house, his pension, and a series of well-managed accounts. It was supposed to be our sunset fund, a way for us to travel to the Mediterranean and enjoy the silence of a job well done. Instead, it became a source of quiet contention that I was too blinded by love to recognize. Julian had always been a golden child in our eyes. He was charismatic, ambitious, and seemed to possess a natural talent for navigating the complexities of the corporate world in Atlanta. He married Cassandra, a woman who moved with a sharp, brittle elegance and worked in high-end real estate. They had 2 beautiful children, Leo and Sophie, whom I adored with a ferocity that only a grandmother can understand. For years I believed we were the quintessential modern family. I hosted the lavish Thanksgiving dinners. I traveled to Atlanta once a month with gifts and baked goods, and I never hesitated to open my checkbook when Julian mentioned a temporary setback. I viewed these contributions as investments in my son's happiness. I did not realize I was merely subsidizing a lifestyle that was being built on the hollow promises of a future payday. The first significant fracture in this facade appeared nearly a year ago. Julian had called me, his voice trembling with a well-rehearsed desperation. He claimed that Cassandra's father was facing an experimental medical procedure in Switzerland that insurance refused to cover. He needed $25,000 immediately to secure the spot. I remember the frantic pace of my heart as I drove to the bank the next morning. I transferred the funds without a single question, driven by the instinct to protect the people my son loved. It was only 3 months later, during a tense dinner at their home, that the truth began to leak through the crack. I had asked Cassandra how her father was adjusting to his post-treatment regimen, only to be met with a look of genuine bewilderment. She told me her father had been playing golf in Florida all summer and had never been healthier. Julian had jumped in, sweating through his expensive silk shirt, claiming I must have confused the details with a friend of theirs. But the lie was too large to ignore. It sat between us like a rotting thing, and for the first time I looked at my son and saw not the boy I had tucked into bed, but a man who viewed his mother as a convenient teammate. I began to pay closer attention to the subtle shifts in their behavior. I noticed the way Cassandra's eyes would linger on the antique silver service during my visits, or how she would casually mention the skyrocketing property values in Savannah. Julian began to steer every conversation toward my long-term health, suggesting that perhaps a large house was too much for a 68-year-old woman to manage. "You're not getting younger, Mom," he would say with a false saccharine concern. "Wouldn't it be easier to move into a luxury assisted living community now? While you're still mobile, you could sell the house, simplify your assets, and have everything ready for the kid." I was a woman who ran 4 miles every morning and managed my own roof repairs. I knew exactly what they were suggesting. They wanted the house liquid. They wanted the inheritance now, and they wanted me tucked away where I wouldn't be a burden on their social calendar. The text message was simply the final, honest culmination of that resentment. It was Julian's way of drawing a line in the sand, assuming that I was a fragile old woman who would be terrified by the prospect of loneliness and would thus comply with any demand just to keep him near. He underestimated the iron that Arthur and I had forged into our lives. That afternoon I did not call him to argue. I did not beg for an explanation. I sat in my study and made a list of every financial contribution I had made to his family over the last 5 years. The total was staggering, nearly $80,000 in miscellaneous emergencies, tuition supplements, and luxury gifts. I realized then that I had been paying for the privilege of being disrespected. My next call was to Silas Thorne, a man who had been our family attorney for 20 years. Silas was a man of few words and immense integrity, a quintessential Southern gentleman who understood that a person's legacy was more than just a balance sheet. When I walked into his office on Broughton Street later that week, the air smelled of old leather and mahogany. I told him everything. I showed him the text message. Silas adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a profound, quiet sympathy. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you have spent your life building a safety net for a man who is currently trying to cut the ropes." "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted to dissolve every joint account I held with Julian. I wanted to move my primary assets into an irrevocable trust. I wanted to ensure that not a single cent of Arthur's hard-earned legacy would ever touch Julian's hands unless I willed it, and at that moment I willed nothing to him. We spent the next several hours drafting the Evelyn Vance irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries were no longer my son and daughter-in-law. Instead, I chose a scholarship fund for underprivileged students at the high school where I had been principal, a local animal sanctuary that specialized in senior dog rescues, and a significant bequest to my niece Elena, who had worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school and never once asked me for a dime. I also set aside a protected fund for Leo and Sophie's education, but it was structured so that neither Julian nor Cassandra could ever access the principal. It was a clean break. As I signed the final documents, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying seemed to lift from my shoulders. I felt lighter, as if the humidity of Savannah had suddenly broken into a cool, refreshing breeze. The storm, however, was only beginning. I had forgotten that Julian still had access to an old emergency account we had established when Arthur first became ill. It was a relic of a different time, a safety measure I had neglected to close. Within 48 hours of my visit to Silas, the phone calls began. I ignored the first 12. By the 13th, I knew I had to face the monster I had partially created through my own indulgence. When I finally answered, Julian's voice was not filled with the fake concern of previous weeks. It was sharp, jagged, and vibrating with an ugly, raw fury. "What have you done, Evelyn?" he hissed, using my first name as a weapon. "I tried to transfer funds for the kids' tuition, and the account is flagged as closed. Then I called the bank, and they told me you've moved the entire investment portfolio. Are you losing your mind?" I sat on my veranda, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder. "I am perfectly sane, Julian," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I am simply following your lead. You told me not to expect you to take care of me. You told me you have your own life and family to worry about. I am respecting those boundaries. I am taking care of myself. I have organized my affairs so that you will never have to worry about the burden of my finances or my care again. You are free, Julian. Isn't that what you wanted? There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his heavy breathing, the sound of a man who realized he had overplayed a hand he didn't actually hold. You can't do this, he finally stammered. That money is my inheritance. Dad would never have wanted this. Do not invoke your father's name to justify your greed. I said, the steel in my voice surprising even me. Your father worked until his last day to ensure we were secure. He did not work so that his son could lie about medical emergencies to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. I know about the Swiss clinic, lied Julian. I know about the lifestyle you've been subsidizing with my retirement. The conversation ended there with him hanging up in a fit of pique, but I knew him well enough to know he would not go quietly. He was a man who felt entitled to the world, and he viewed my autonomy as a personal theft. A week later, the physical confrontation occurred. I was in my garden, pruning the azaleas that Arthur had planted for our 25th anniversary, when a silver SUV screeched into my driveway. Julian burst through the gate, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy purple. Cassandra was right behind him, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown of thorns. She looked around my garden with a sneer that she didn't even bother to hide. Evelyn, we need to talk about this rationally, she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that turned my stomach. Julian is under a lot of stress. That text was a mistake, a moment of weakness. We're family. You can't just cut us out because of a few poorly chosen words. I didn't stand up immediately. I finished pruning a particularly stubborn branch before looking at them. It wasn't just the words, Cassandra, I said. It was the years of viewing me as a ledger rather than a mother. It was the casual suggestions that I should move out of my home so you could access the equity. It was the lie about your father's health. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. What you two have done is a calculated campaign of emotional and financial exploitation. Julian stepped toward me, his shadow looming over the garden bed. I'll fight this, Mom. I'll have you declared incompetent. No judge in Georgia will believe a woman your age should be moving millions of dollars into a trust without consulting her heirs. You're acting erratic. You're being vindictive and paranoid. I stood up, then brushing the soil from my knees, and looked him directly in the eye. I had coached him through baseball games, I had cheered at his graduation, and I had held him when he failed his first bar exam. I knew every tell, every flicker of insecurity in his gaze. Try it, Julian, I said softly. I have already undergone a full cognitive evaluation with Dr. Helena Vane, one of the most respected geriatric specialists in the state. I have a clean bill of health, pristine medical records, and a sworn affidavit from my attorney. I have documented every cent I have given you and every lie you have told to obtain it. If you want to go to court and explain to a judge why you sent a text message abandoning your mother while simultaneously demanding her money, please be my guest. I would love to see how that plays out in the local papers. The look of pure, unadulterated hatred that crossed his face in that moment was something I will never forget. It was the death of my son as I knew him. He realized then that he had no leverage. He could not bully me and he could not charm me. He turned and stormed back to the car, Cassandra trailing behind him like a silent, angry shadow. As they drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in my driveway, I felt a profound sense of mourning. Not for the relationship we had, but for the one I had imagined we had. I went inside and locked my doors, a practice I had never felt the need to do in the 30 years I had lived in that house. The following months were a masterclass in the psychological warfare of the entitled. First came the letters from a high-priced firm in Atlanta suggesting that I was under the undue influence of my attorney. Silas Thorne handled those with a dry professional wit that left them with nowhere to turn. Then came the phone calls from Julian's friends, people I had known since they were children, who had been fed a narrative of my supposed mental decline. I had to systematically reach out to my own community, my book club, my former colleagues, and my church group to let them know the truth. It was humiliating at first, the feeling of having to defend my sanity to people who had known me for decades, but it was also a cleansing process. I learned who my true friends were. I learned that my community was far more resilient than Julian's greed. The true cruelty, however, was the weaponization of my grandchildren. For 3 months, I was denied any contact with Leo and Sophie. My calls went to voicemail, my letters were returned unopened, and my requests for a weekend visit were met with silence. This was the one area where Julian still held power, and he used it with a ruthlessness that broke my heart daily. I would sit in their empty bedrooms in my house looking at the toys and books I had bought for their next visit and feel an ache that no amount of logic could soothe. I considered surrendering. I considered calling Julian and telling him he could have the house, the money, everything, if he would just let me see the children. But Silas reminded me of a hard truth. If you give in now, Evelyn, you aren't just giving them money. You are teaching those children that love is a commodity to be traded for compliance. You are teaching them that their father's behavior is acceptable. Is that the legacy you want to leave them? He was right. I had to be the adult Julian refused to be. I filed for grandparent visitation rights under Georgia law, a process that was grueling and emotionally draining. During the mediation phase, I had to sit across from Julian and Cassandra as they argued that I was a negative influence, that my erratic behavior was confusing the children. I sat there with a folder of photos, Leo and Sophie, laughing in my garden as baking cookies the hours we spent reading. I showed the mediator the text message Julian had sent me. I asked a simple question: how can a man who claims I am a danger to his children be the same man who was asking me for $50,000 for a business opportunity? Only 6 months ago the mediation failed, as I knew it would, but it laid the groundwork for the court hearing. The hearing took place on a humid Tuesday in November. The courtroom was small, panelled in dark wood that felt like it was closing in on us. Julian sat with his lawyer, looking polished and aggrieved. I sat with Silas, feeling every one of my 68 years. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about money. I talked about Arthur. I talked about the values we had tried to instill in our son. I talked about the responsibility of a legacy. I told the judge that I didn't want my son's life to be ruined, but I refused to let my own life be erased. I am a woman who has served this community for 35 years, I said, looking directly at the judge. I have educated thousands of children. I have managed multi-million-dollar school budgets. I am not a victim of my age. I am a veteran of it. My son made a choice to distance himself from my care, and I have made a choice to distance him from my estate. That is my right as a sentient, independent adult. The judge, a woman who looked as though she had seen every iteration of family betrayal, didn't take long to deliberate. She granted me supervised visitation every other weekend and warned Julian and Cassandra that any attempt to interfere with the court's order would result in contempt charges. It wasn't the total victory I had hoped for. I wanted the children to come to me because they loved me, not because a judge ordered it, but it was a start. It was a bridge back to the only part of Julian's life that I still cared to preserve. As the legal battles faded, a new and darker truth began to emerge. I hired a private investigator to look into Julian's financial situation, mostly to protect myself from any future liability. What he found was a horror story of modern excess. Julian and Cassandra weren't just living beyond their means, they were drowning. They had leveraged their home in Atlanta to the hilt. They had massive credit card debt, and Julian had been involved in a series of high-risk speculative investments that had turned sour. The money I had been giving them wasn't for emergencies. It was to pay the interest on their mounting debt. They weren't waiting for my inheritance because they wanted to be wealthy. They were waiting for it because they were desperate to avoid total financial collapse. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. 3 months after the court hearing, Julian's firm let him go after an internal audit revealed he had been padding his expense account. Without his salary, the house in Atlanta went into foreclosure within 90 days. Cassandra, unable to deal with the loss of status, moved back to her parents' home in Florida, taking the children with her. Julian was left alone in a rented apartment facing a mountain of debt and a reputation in tatters. I received a call from him on a cold January night. His voice was hollow, stripped of the arrogance and the fury that had defined him for a year. "Mummy," whispered, "I've lost everything. I don't know what to do. The bank took the car. The house is gone. Cassandra is filing for divorce. I have nothing." I sat in my quiet kitchen, the same place where this had all begun, with a single text message. I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct to rush to his side, to pay off his debts, to bring him home and tell him everything would be okay. But I looked at the folder on my desk, the text message, the legal documents, the records of his lies. "Julian," I said, and my heart felt like it was made of lead, "I am sorry you are suffering. I truly am. But you told me that you had your own life and your own family. You told me not to expect anything from you. I have honored that. I have built a life that does not include your chaos. I cannot save you from the consequences of your own choices. That would not be love. That would be an insult to the man you could have been. I will continue to see Leo and Sophie. I will ensure they are cared for and educated, but I will not be your financial safety net. You are 40 years old, Julian. It is time for you to learn how to be a man without using your mother's soul as collateral." I hung up the phone and cried for the first time in a year. I cried for Arthur. I cried for the little boy who used to catch fireflies in the yard, and I cried for the man who was now sitting in the dark, realizing that he had traded his mother's love for a lifestyle he couldn't keep. But even through the tears, I knew I had done the right thing. Life in Savannah transformed for me after that. With the legal drama settled and Julian's influence removed, I began to truly inhabit my own existence. I realized that for years I had been living a life of quiet service to a son who didn't appreciate it. Now I lived for myself and for the causes that mattered to me. I spent my mornings at the animal sanctuary bottle, feeding orphan puppies and helping senior dogs find homes. I worked with the scholarship committee meeting the bright-eyed young people who would be the beneficiaries of Arthur's hard work. I traveled not to follow Julian's family on their vacations, but to see the places I had always dreamed of. I went to Kyoto to see the cherry blossoms. I went to the coast of Maine to paint the lighthouses. Leo and Sophie began to visit me regularly. Without the poisonous influence of their parents' greed, our relationship blossomed into something pure and beautiful. They loved the garden, they loved the stories I told them about their grandfather, and they loved the sense of peace that permeated my home. I never spoke ill of their father to them. I simply showed them what it looked like to live a life of integrity, kindness, and self-respect. I hoped that by seeing my strength, they would learn to find their own. One afternoon, a few years later, I was sitting on a park bench in Forsyth Park, watching the children play near the fountain. A young woman sat down next to me, struggling with a toddler and a heavy diaper bag. We struck up a conversation, and she mentioned how hard it was to balance everything, how she felt like she was constantly failing everyone. I looked at her, seeing a younger version of myself, the version that thought sacrifice was the only language of love. I told her something that had taken me nearly 70 years to truly understand. "You cannot pour from an empty cup," I told her. Loving your family does not mean erasing yourself. It does not mean allowing yourself to be mistreated in the name of loyalty. True legacy isn't about the money you leave behind. It's about the character you demonstrate while you're here. If you don't respect yourself, you are teaching your children that they don't have to respect you either. Set your boundaries early and set them in stone. The people who truly love you will respect them. The people who don't were never truly loving you to begin with. She looked at me with a startled kind of clarity, and I realized that my story wasn't just about a betrayal. It was about an awakening. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. I had protected Arthur's legacy, not by hoarding it, but by ensuring it went toward making the world a slightly better place rather than funding a black hole of entitlement. As I walked back toward my home on Gaston Street, the sun setting behind the steeples of the city, I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. I was 73 years old, and I was more alive than I had ever been. I had learned that the greatest gift you can give your children is not an inheritance of gold, but an inheritance of example. I had shown Julian that a mother's love is unconditional, but her dignity is non-negotiable. I had shown my grandchildren that age is not a descent into weakness, but an ascent into power. And I had shown myself that it is never too late to rewrite the ending of your own story. The lesson of my life is simple yet profound. We often spend our best years building monuments for people who may never appreciate the foundation. We sacrifice our peace for their comfort, our dreams for their ambitions, and our dignity for their approval. But the moment you realize that your worth is not tied to your utility to others is the moment you become truly free. My son's text message was meant to be a threat of isolation, a way to keep me in my place. Instead, it was the key that unlocked the cage of my own making. I am Evelyn Vance, and I am not a burden. I am a legacy. I am a woman who chose herself, and in doing so, I finally learned what it means to truly live. The moral of this journey is that family is a bond of mutual respect, not a contract of blind obligation. To anyone listening to these words, remember that you are the architect of your own value. Do not let the fear of loneliness drive you into the arms of exploitation. Build your life on the bedrock of self-respect and let your legacy be one of strength, not surrender. For in the end, the only person you truly have to face in the mirror every morning is yourself, and that person deserves your fiercest protection and your deepest love.